introduce Dr. Ed Larson. Dr. Ed Larson is now the university professor, a very distinguished title here at Pepperdine, and the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law at the Pepperdine University Law School. Professor Larson is the author of 7 books and over 100 published articles. Ed writes mostly about issues of science, medicine, and law from a historical perspective. He has such books as A Magnificent Catastrophe and the Scopes, Summer for the God, the Scopes Trial, and America's continuing debate over science and religion, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. Ed is not only a wonderful scholar, but a guy who lives across the street from him, or from me, I guess, not from him, from me, and someone I go on hikes with all the time and has been a great mentor figure to me. Dr. Paul Contino will be responding to him shortly from Pepperdine as well. Let us give warm welcome to Dr. Ed Larson.
Thank you, Chris, but thank you most not for that introduction, but for doing all the work that made this conference possible. It's just been amazing the way you have, and every speaker will recognize the emails they must have gotten organizing all this. It's been amazing. So I really appreciate all the work you've put on to make this this conference possible. So, in fact, I'd like to even let us give him a round of applause for all he's done. Thank you. Now, I'm in the unenviable position of following Michael Roos and Ron Numbers. And what we've ended up doing is sort of putting history on its head and gone backward in history. That is, later, then earlier, now earliest. And indeed, I'm in the added position of my whole presentation today is sort of a 45-minute elaboration of one sentence in Michael Roos's presentation. When he said one sentence, if you remember, I remember the sentence because he summarized in a sentence everything I'm going to say, or I'm going to elaborate on, and then went on to more important things. So I'm going to draw us back to one time in England and the response to Darwinism. I also want to note, I put up here this sort of famous picture of Darwin superimposed over the book we keep seeing. We do know that right now we are held in this conference now because we are as close as we possibly can get. This week, if it's a weekend conference, as close as we can get to the 150th anniversary of the publication of Origin of Species, which was 150 years ago, what, next Tuesday, the 22nd? November 22nd. But that would coincide with Thanksgiving weekend here, and we didn't think many people would show up for a conference on Thanksgiving weekend. So there you have it. There's our timing. Now, as I say, this was the book, copy of later edition of the book with Darwin's picture. That was published in 1859. Now, within 1 week of the publication with 1 week of having received a pre-publication copy of that book. So this does coincide with this week. What I'm saying right now does coincide with this very moment. Darwin sent a few pre-publication copies of his book out. Came out before his book. And one of the copies he very properly sent, and I hope some of my students remember me when they write important books. He sent and I hope I don't respond quite like this man did. Darwin sent a pre-publication copy to his former teacher, we see here, Adam Sedgwick, who was a Cambridge University geologist and an ordained Anglican minister. And as soon as Sedgwick got the book, he read it. He had finished it before the book even came out. And he wrote Darwin a note. Now, it's not the sort of note you want to get from your former teachers. He wrote to Darwin, "I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. 'Tis the crown and glory of organic science that it does, through final cause, link material to moral. You have ignored this link, and if I do not mistake your meaning, you have done your best in one of 2 pregnant cases to break it. Were it possible, which, thank God, it is not, to break it, humanity, in my mind, would suffer a damage that might brutalize it. Well, I think every word in here was carefully chosen. He makes the point, first he makes the point that he's pained by what he reads here. Then he makes the point that it's the crown and glory of organic science, of biology, that it does, and he underlines these next words, that it does through final cause, those are underlined, link the material, the physical world, us, with the moral, the spiritual world. And he says, you've ignored it, and indeed, I think you've tried to break it. But I don't think it's possible. Thank God it's not possible. But if you could break it, if you could break that link between the material and the moral, it would brutalize, reduce to the state of a brute. So now, that was the response. Now, Origin of Species, of course, was the book that Darwin used to launch publicly his theory of evolution by natural selection, itself a product of over 2 decades of painstaking, largely private research that, in turn, followed in the wake of Darwin's round-the-world voyage as a young naturalist aboard the British survey ship HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836. And we've already seen this picture, but this is what Darwin looked like then, or very soon thereafter. It was during this voyage that Darwin first took seriously the ancient Greek idea that current plant and animal species evolved from pre-existing species rather than have been specially created by God. As an idea, evolution was as old as science itself, but it had never gained widespread acceptance among scientists until Darwin's day. Yet, less than a decade after publication of Origin of Species, British science leader T.H. Huxley could write to Darwin, quote, "You will have the rare happiness to see your ideas triumphant in your lifetime." And the great Scottish naturalist Wyville Thomson could add, quote, and this is about 1872, "There is scarcely a single competent general naturalist who is not prepared to accept some form of the doctrine of evolution." But that too is worded carefully. What form? That became the issue. What form of evolution was to be accepted? Now, writing to Darwin after he received his advanced copy of Origin of Species, the great Harvard botanist Asa Gray also expressed concern about the theory's moral and theological implications. Now, Darwin wrote back. We have Darwin's reply to Asa Gray, a famous letter, where he writes back, "I had no intention to write atheistically, but I own that I cannot see, as plainly as others do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. There seems to be too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ictimonia with the express intention of their feeding within the living body of caterpillars." Then, alluding to William Paley's famous analogy between a crafted telescope and the human eye, Darwin then noted, "Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed. Even human nature and mental ability might result from natural process," he added in his letter to Gray. Now, Gray went on to arrange for the publication of Origin of Species in the United States and quickly became a convert to evolutionism. But again, when we look at Gray and his response, we're asked again, what form of evolutionism did Gray accept? Look again at Darwin's letter to Gray. The sequence in it is telling. It passed quickly from observations of what seemed bad in nature, such as cruel animal behavior, which believers hesitate to blame on God, to their implications for what seemed good in nature, such as the human eye, which Victorians typically credited to God, and then moved on to ponder the origin of what seems best of all, human morality and mentality, which Victorian natural theologians hailed as the ultimate example and proof of the divine supernatural. In Origin of Species, Darwin avoided making comments about human evolution, fearing that they would prejudice readers against his general theory. But in his private notes that we have, of course, and his private essays and his personal letters, looking at these reveal his long-standing fascination with the issue. Indeed, it is apparent from these that his main issue and his main interest in the theory of evolution was not how it applied to the Galapagos finches, it was how it applied to humans. Take, for example, his earliest private notebooks on evolution are peppered with comparisons between the native peoples of Terra del Fuego, whom he met during his Beagle voyage and considered the lowest form of humanity, with primates in the London Zoo, suggesting that humans and human morality was really no different from that of other animals in their behavior. Darwin wrote, and you can sort of capture it in pictures that appear in his books, and I'll use a couple, but you'll see the pictures that he puts in his book of the various types of primates, they almost always have human expressions or almost look human. And this is one of them, one of the pictures from one of his books. Darwin wrote in 1839, notice 1839, that was just after he privately accepted the idea of evolution, 20 years before he wrote Origin of the Species. He wrote in a private notebook, "Let man visit orangutan in domestication, hear expressive whine, see its intelligence, and then let man dare to boast of his proud preeminence." Here he inserted, in the notebook, the sentence, "Not understanding language of the Fuegians puts them on a par with monkeys." In a later entry, Darwin demanded, quote, "Compare the Fuegians and orangutans, and dare say difference so great." Darwin frequently speculated in these private notebooks about animal origins of human traits, such as when he wrote in 1839, again 2 decades before publishing The Origin of Species, "One's tendency to kiss and almost to bite that which one sexually loves is probably due to our distant ancestors having been like dogs to bitches." This was shortly after he got married. As for the vaunted, quote, "mind of man," Darwin concluded, quote, it is no more perfect than instincts of animals," end quote. Human thought itself, like animal instinct, he attributed to brain structure, chiding himself right in his notebook, "Oh, you materialist!" exclamation point, for saying so. Constantly he probed the perceived boundary questions. Quote, "Does a negress blush? I'm almost sure the Fuegians did," he asked himself at one point. Animals, I think, would not. Now, while Darwin avoided publicly commenting on human evolution, his most visible scientific supporter, the naturalist T.H. Huxley, took up the cause and made it his own. In 1863, 3 years after The Origin of Species appeared, Huxley packaged the pieces of his various arguments on the topic into a single popular book called Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature. He concluded in that book, whatever system of organs be studied, the structural difference between that separate man from the gorilla and the chimpanzee are not so great as those which separate the gorilla from the lower apes. And of course, in that book, we get his famous chain of beings showing the sort of the differences between the different primates today. Now, the most vexing question, though, now here he's talking about body structure. Look, he's showing the structural similarities, and the quote I just gave, he was talking about the structural similarities between the gibbons and the orangutans and chimpanzees, gorillas, man. Yet the most vexing question raised by Darwinism concerned the origins of the human mentality and moral attributes, particularly, and people pick this up right away, particularly the source of altruistic behavior. Could these distinguishing human characteristics, oh, not the body, we're clearly not made in the image of God in the body unless God's a pretty awkward structure. No, it's this altruistic behavior, human mentality and moral attributes. Could these distinguishing human characteristics have evolved from naturalistic processes? This is what Victorian evolutionists asked. Or did God implant them in an evolved human body? Now, traditionally, Christian theologians had attributed these attributes to an indwelling soul, the existence of which lifted humans above other animals. Scientists generally segregated humans from other animals on this basis as well. From Aristotle's theory of the rational soul found only in humans, through the Cartesian dualism splitting physical matter from the human and divine soul, to George Cuvier's division of humans and primates into separate taxonomic orders, now Huxley, in Man's Place in Nature, lumped humans in the same order with other primates and boldly asked, quote, "Is the philosopher or the saint to give up his endeavors to lead a noble life because the simplest study of man's nature reveals, at its foundations, all of the selfish passions and fierce appetites of the meanest quadruped? Is mother love vile because a hen shows it, or fidelity base because dogs possess it?" These were the new questions of the Darwinian age. Well, let's go back to Darwin a little older. After steering clear of the intense public debate over human evolution for over a decade, in 1871, Darwin finally articulated his thinking on the subject in the book Descent of Man. He wrote, "The sole object of this work is to consider, firstly, whether man, like every other species, is descended from some pre-existing form, secondly, the manner of his development, and thirdly, the value of the differences between the so-called races of man." In this book, Darwin raised the key issues that would thereafter occupy researchers in the field. Now, Darwin's basic case for human evolution consisted of two main parts. First, he presented the by then well-known evidence for the evolution of the human body. In anatomical structure and embryonic development, people resemble other animals, he noted, and the persistence of monkey-like rudimentary features, such as the tailbone, reinforced the conclusion that the human body evolved from lower forms. Relying primarily on structural similarities, Darwin traced human ancestry, and I'm quoting from the book, from the most ancient progenitors in the kingdom of the vertebrae through ancient fishes and amphibians, early marsupials, and to the New World and Old World monkey, and from the latter, at a remote period, to man, the wonder and glory of the universe. Well, this is all the body's evolution. That's already been dealt with by Huxley. Even if you accept the body's evolution, it did not settle, as people understood it then, it did not settle the matter because many believed that humans stood apart from animals not because of their bodies, but because of their minds and emotions. Darwin thus extended in this book, In Descent of Man, which is where he went beyond Huxley in so many ways, he extended his naturalistic analysis to include those mental and moral attributes that supposedly uplifted humanity, such as, and these were the ones already recognized and being debated for a decade in Victorian England, things like higher reasoning, self-consciousness, religious devotion, and the ability to love. The mental powers and moral feelings of humans differed in degree rather than in kind from those of other animals, Darwin asserted, with a progressive gradient linking the lowest beast to the highest humans. Darwin stressed the human-like qualities of higher animals. Again, another picture showing a grasping, intelligent-looking monkey. But in his book, he focuses in looking at these human-like qualities of higher animals. He particularly focuses on wild monkeys, which he talks about quite a bit, and pet dogs, which he adored. And comparing that with the animal-like qualities of what he called the lowest savages. For example, he wrote in a typical passage, "Can we feel sure that an old dog with an excellent memory never reflects on his past pleasures of the chase, and that this is a form of self-consciousness? On the other hand, how little can the hard-working wife of a degraded Australian savage reflect on the nature of her own existence?" Exclamation point. Similarly, Darwin doubted whether Fuegians felt religious devotion, yet, as he put it, he saw some distinct approach to this state of mind in the deep love of a dog for his master. Now, Darwin attributed the evolution of even the most ennobling human traits to gradual survival of the fittest processes. Long ago in Africa, he suggested, some anthropodal ape descended from the trees, started walking upright in the open spaces, began using their hands to hold and to hunt, and developed their brains, all in incremental steps that helped to preserve the individual or the group. As an origin of species, the variations themselves were either inborn or acquired, with beneficial ones propagated through natural selection. Darwin envisioned the winnowing process at work among individuals, nationalities, races, and civilizations, with his own race of Englishmen then in possession of the largest global empire ever in history, advancing to the fore. Well, Descent of Man offered the first comprehensive naturalistic theory of the evolution of human morality. But, and this is the important but, it did not change many minds. It didn't have the immediate and widespread influence that, say, Origin of Species had. Europeans and Americans had hotly debated the proposition that humans evolved from beasts ever since the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. But long after the appearance of Descent of Man in 1871, most continued to reject the idea that human mentality and morality evolved naturalistically. The skeptics included many evolutionists within Darwin's inner circle. For example, the co-discoverer of selection theory, Alfred Russel Wallace, who remained a staunch Darwinist on other matters, became persuaded that what he called an overruling intelligence created the first humans by ennobling anthropodal apes with enlightened minds. He wrote in 1869, and maintained ever after, natural selection could only have endowed the savage with a brain just a little superior to that of an ape, whereas he actually possesses one but very little inferior to that of the average member of our learned societies. Darwin's mentor and friend, geologist Charles Lyell, promptly endorsed Wallace's position, much to Darwin's dismay. For his part, Asa Gray steadfastly maintained that God supervised the beneficial variations that produced humankind. The triumph of evolutionism within the Victorian scientific community during the 1860s did not quickly translate into widespread popular acceptance of the theory, at least with respect to human morality or the spiritual soul. Science did not then dominate how Europeans and Americans viewed the natural world, much less how they viewed the supernatural world. The matter of human morality was particularly sensitive because it impacted how people viewed themselves, other people, and God. Crucially, evolutionary naturalism undermined belief in the indwelling spiritual soul, which for many people defined the very essence of humanness and gave them hope for an afterlife. The doctrine that God specially created the first people by giving them eternal souls carried with it certain implications about the meaning of human life. The theory that humans evolved naturalistically from soulless animals created others, and many individuals found it difficult to switch. I could give many examples of this tension that appeared in Victorian society, but I'll just choose this one that I found looking through the magazine. In 1871, I was looking at reviews of Descent of Man, how Descent of Man was received. Well, Punch back then was sort of like, I don't know, they had cartoons like the New Yorker has cartoons. And people really, it was a popular magazine. And the the elite of England, as well as the middle class, liked to read their cartoons at least. They'd stand in the newsstand and flip through the cartoons and then put the magazine back in the rack, I suppose, like I do the New Yorker. And because I don't have time to read the long stories. And so this was the issue right after Descent of Man came out. And this shows how people were following these issues. I mean, this is not some scholarly book that only academics were reading. This was a cartoon in the next issue of Punch magazine. And so it shows this wonderful picture, this wonderful cartoon of a man reading to his wife and daughter in front of the fireplace, this home scene, this wonderful little vignette. And of course, you'd imagine that what the person in the vignette would be reading would be the Bible to his wife or his child, or maybe Dickens. He might be reading Dickens. But no, he's reading Descent of Man. And you can't, I'll read you the caption if you can't quite get it. It says, the caption reads, starting with the man speaking, "So you see, Mary, baby is descended from a hairy quadruped with pointed ears and a tail. We all are." To which the wife counters, "Speak for yourself, Jack. I'm not descended from anything of the kind, I beg to say, and baby takes after me." Yes. This was the response, the immediate response. And I think it captures a wider thoughts and discussions of what people were talking about. Well, and it is shown later. Here's Wallace a little later in life. He could then claim, based on this sort of reaction, Wallace could then claim, with some hyperbole, I'm sure, but he could then write that, quote, "All of the greatest writers and thinkers agree that the higher human and spiritual nature of man is not the mere animal nature advanced to the survival of the fittest." That's Wallace, a Darwinist, speaking later in life about the acceptance of Darwin theory as respect to the human higher mentality and spiritual nature. Now, how could he come to this? Well, you could just scan the horizon. Novelist Leo Tolstoy proclaimed this view in Russia, for example, and the prominent liberal minister in America, Harry Ward Beecher, did so here in the United States. Both embraced evolutionism to a point, but maintained that only God could make a soul. The Roman Catholic Church fitfully gravitated toward accepting a similar position. During the late 1800s, British Prime Minister William Gladstone made a point of endorsing the divine creation of humankind, and his perennial competitor, back and forth, Disraeli, wouldn't even go that far. Whether expressed in scientific commentary or editorial cartoons, the basic sentiment was simple. Most people simply refused to believe that their highly developed minds, morals, or emotions evolved from those of beasts. The gap appeared to them too great. They felt themselves superior to animals. For many, these feelings carried more weight than an abstract scientific theory. I'll throw in another cartoon to show the whites. A year later, Darwin follows up follows up Descent of Man by making much the same arguments in a pictorial sense in a book called The Expressions of Emotions in Man and Animals, using photographs to show how similar their expressions were, and those expressions were supposed to be insight to their inner being. So here you've got Fun magazine coming out immediately after. You can date it. It's right after publication. Their response to, they have this woman talking to a tailed Darwin. And remember, the title of the book is Expressions of Emotions in Man and Animals. And she says, "Really, Mr. Darwin, say what you like about man, but I wish you would leave my emotions alone." Well, just as some people instinctively rejected the idea of the evolution of human morality, others embraced it for reasons that had little to do with science. Materialists, atheists, and radical secularists had long displayed a certain fondness for evolutionary theories of origins, such as Lamarckism, anything to dispense with God. Now, even though, as Michael Roos emphasized this morning. Even though Darwin held strictly conventional political and economic views, his theories attracted the usual crowd. Huxley and the influential German biologist Ernst Haeckel initially embraced Darwinism in part because it supported their anti-clerical agendas for science and society. For Haeckel, too, it supported his monist philosophy that postulated a consilience of matter and morality, which became something of a secular religion in early 20th century Germany. In the Americas, feminist leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton welcomed Darwinism as a means to undermine what she saw as biblically based arguments for the subordination of women. She wrote, "The real difficulty in women's case is that the whole foundation of the Christian religion rests on her temptation and fall. If, however, we accept the Darwinian theory that the race has been a gradual growth from the lower to the higher form of life, and the story of the fall is a myth, well, we can exonerate the snake, emancipate the woman, and reconstruct a more rational religion for the 19th century." Well, those are speaking generally from what we would call, and they would call, the political left. But it's not limited to liberal secular thought. You can also look at conservative secular thought. From the right wing of the political spectrum, the enormously influential social philosopher Herbert Spencer, already an evolutionist before Darwin published Descent of Man, freely worked Darwinian materialism into his progressivist philosophy of social development, which was dubbed social Darwinism by its critics. It probably should be referred to as social Spencerianism, but science carried more clout, and so its critics like to call it social Darwinism. Haeckel carried these ideas to the German-speaking world with translated editions of his most popular books, returning back to Britain to reinforce social Darwinism at home. And here you can get a sense, if you just want to look up there, you can see how this is from Haeckel's most popular book, widely reprinted. You can find it probably in any American library that dates back that far. And he shows man-like apes down at the bottom and how the humans have broken apart into different strands and where they are relative to each other. And you can see who he thinks is high and who he thinks is low. And it has an amazing correlation with who Hitler later thought was high and later thought was low. As social theorists, Spencer, Haeckel, and Darwin became inexorably linked in the public mind during the late 19th century. Spencer's many followers, whose numbers comprised a virtual social registry of the Anglo-American moneyed elite, typically embraced Darwinism as well. Now, this is an extreme example, but you can find other ones, I believe, or the sense of this among some other Victorians. You can look at the autobiography of industrialist Andrew Carnegie. And in it, at one point, he recalls the day in the 1870s that his reading of, and he specifically lists them, Darwin's Descent of Man, not Origin of the Species, Descent of Man, and a list of books by Spencer transformed his life. He wrote, "I remember that light came in as a flood, and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I had found the truth of evolution. Man was not created with the instinct of his own degradation, but from the lower he had risen to the higher forms." And I think this is another picture from Haeckel's book showing humans right there on top. For people like Carnegie, Darwinism became a religion, or at least an alternative source of human moral and ethical values. Pictorially, this sentiment appeared in a popular 1883 poster attributed to the London secularist George Holyoake that purported to illustrate the fragmentation of the established British national church into various factions ranging from Roman Catholicism and High Church to dissent and rationalism. Now, the center is the leaders of the Anglican Church trying to hold down the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. And if you go back, this is only a quarter because the poster is just too big to capture in any picture that can be seen. And you'll have other groups going down toward Catholicism, leaving this dome-like Episcopal church that's trying to reach everybody. And you'll see others going down to dissent and low church, and you'll see others going off to the more evangelical strains. But in this corner, this is the corner that goes up toward rationalism. And what you see in there is various different visible figures of England of the day, but I'll capture in on this one part. Way up there, you'll see an ape leading Spencer, Huxley, and other agnostics, as they're called, away from the central umbrella-like dome of St. Paul's Cathedral toward a distant cloud of protoplasm. A bust of Darwin rises above the clouds, as you'll see there. With his great white beard, Darwin could readily appear godlike as apish, as you saw him in an earlier cartoon. And during the late 19th century, cartoonists had a field day, picturing him either in this godlike form or in this apish form. It had less to do with science than with society. Well, in some ways, little has changed in the past century. Many otherwise committed evolutionists draw the line on materialism when it comes to the ascent of man and the basis for human values. Indeed, even T.H. Huxley sidestepped the issue by stressing that humans, because of our big brains, did not need to derive their values from nature. More recently, the Oxford evolutionary ornithologist David Lack, whose 1847 study of Darwin's finches gave wing to the modern neo-Darwinian synthesis. And I should say, since the issue was raised earlier by Michael Roos of how these finches got their name, no, it wasn't Darwin. It was this man who gave them their name, or confirmed their name, with his book, Darwin's Finches, that actually, for the first time, in a persuasive way, put forward the theory of the neo-Darwinian synthesis that Michael Roos was talking about, as applied in actual field study and field case. He nevertheless, same year he published his great book, Darwin's Finches, he wrote another tract in which he said of the higher attributes of humans, quote, "Science has not accounted for morality, truth, beauty, individual responsibility, or self-awareness, and many people hold that from its nature it can never do so." Similarly, the noted American geneticist Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project during the 1990s and now directs the National Institutes of Health, writes, "Science will certainly not shed any light on what it means to love someone, what it means to have a spiritual dimension to our existence, nor will it tell us much about the character of God." Opinion surveys suggest that Collins speaks for about 40% of Americans, the American people, and up to a like percentage of American scientists, when he posits God as somehow involved in the evolutionary process, at least to the extent of breathing supernaturally created souls into naturally evolved bodies. For the record, the Roman Catholic Church approves the later position. And indeed, I think it's captured. This cartoon appeared in the New Yorker shortly after the Roman Catholic Church made its particular thought on that, and it captures sort of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Indeed, Pope John Paul II, in a 1996 message to the Pontifical Academy of Science, wrote, "Rather than the theory of evolution, we should speak of several theories of evolution, materialistic, reductionist, and spiritualist. Theories of evolution which, in accordance with the philosophies inspiring them, consider the mind as emerging from the forces of living matter or as mere epiphenomena of this matter are incompatible with the truth about man," end quote. Now, most scientists no longer think this way. However, like Darwin, many of them, polls suggest maybe 3 in 5, see human mental and moral attributes, including altruistic behavior and belief in God, as products of natural forces, or as British science writer Richard Dawkins likes to put it, a blind watchmaker. Now, Dawkins' books, which we've referred to already in this conference, have become bestsellers in the United States and Britain, and his vision of human evolution, or more precisely the vision that he popularized from the work of such preeminent late 20th century biologists as William Hamilton and E.O. Wilson. And here I think I've got a picture of Dawkins between William Hamilton and E.O. Wilson, the only one I could find. This view is shared by many evolutionary biologists today. Humans, like all living organisms, Dawkins tells us, quote, are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish material molecules known as genes. Now, the genes themselves, according to Dawkins, cannot plan ahead or respond to their environment. They simply reproduce themselves with occasional random mutations that may or may not assist their survival. And we are the astonishing or astonished result. Dawkins finds this view of life exhilarating. For him, it frees humans from the burdens of purposeful design in nature, which he identified as, quote, the most influential of the arguments for the existence of God. Unlike the controlling purposes of a designing God, Darwin exalts, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin describes and which we now know as the explanations for the existence of an apparently purposeful form of life, had no purpose in mind. That's Dawkins' words. And here's another Dawkins picture. Adding urgency to the matter for Dawkins is his conviction that the widespread acceptance of an evolutionary view of life would free society from the destructive consequences of religion. In the preface to his latest bestseller, The God Delusion, Dawkins described the not-so-subtle ad for his popular BBC documentary called The Root of All Evil. Over a caption, and this is the ad for his television documentary, over the caption, "Imagine a world without religion," the ad reprints a picture of the Manhattan skyline with the Twin Towers still standing. In the book, Darwin adds, quote, imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts, and so on. A world without religion, he says, and nothing good is missing. As Dawkins sees it, belief in God and religion once served a Darwinian purpose by helping to bind small tribes together in opposition to others. Now that those small competing tribes have become large nations or ethnic groups with access to weapons of mass destruction, however, the persistence of this evolutionary trait has become so destructive that it could potentially destroy human society altogether. This, I believe, is what gives the urgency to what Dawkins is saying in his own mind. Only by understanding a new meme, Dawkins might say, can humanity overcome its now destructive God gene. Humans should be mature enough to develop and maintain our own ethical codes informed by scientific knowledge of its consequence, he argues, rather than relying on an ancient moral code inscribed in scriptural texts of human origin composed in a different era for reasons that no longer apply. Well, Dawkins finally brings the story to where Adam Sedgwick feared that it would end 150 years ago when he read his pre-publication copy of Origin of the Species. Indeed, from the very outset, what readers generally found most exciting or frightening about Darwinism was the prospect that humans evolved from beasts by a naturalistic process that goes back to some material cause and effect chain to the earliest form of life. Humans, after all, even those steeped in science or theology, care most about themselves and their own kind. And this is captured again in another cartoon from Punch that came out in direct response to Huxley's work in this field in the early 1860s, where it shows this is a proper party. Back then, if you had a proper party, you had somebody introducing the guests as they came through the door, saying, here it is, the Duchess of whatever, and here it is. You've probably seen it in My Fair Lady when they introduce the Rex Harrison and Audrey Hepburn. Well, here he is, and in the season, of course, the lion of the season is the most important social figure of that particular day who catches the attention. So here, Huxley, who can be made to look like a monkey with his big sideburns, is walking in. Everybody would recognize that as Huxley at the time, but he's being introduced by the alarmed, notice it says the alarmed person who's doing the introduction, saying, Mr. Gorilla is entering the social scene of England. That's how people saw it right away. And that's what they saw it happening right away. Dawkins now expresses this view in starkly dogmatic terms, but except for the bits about genes, which were unknown in the 19th century, he does not claim to say anything more than Darwin said in Descent of Man, or if you read it more closely, in Origin of Species. Today, Darwin's sketchy social theories have matured by way of E.O. Wilson's sociobiology and modern evolutionary psychology to become foundational for understanding in the social sciences. Through it, human behavior is reduced to the physical, and people become matter in motion with evolved self-consciousness. Meanwhile, the rapid march of neurobiology joins evolutionary psychology in linking human mentality with the Darwinian material. Although Sedgwick closed his 1859 letter to Charles Darwin with a light-hearted reference to himself as, quote, a son of a monkey, that's how he closed it, he never gave ground on a divine source for the human soul. For him, and for most other Victorians, and for many people today, that was no laughing matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks for all your work for over 10 years on this subject. Thanks to you and Chris and many others here, Bill, for helping us with Faith and Reason, this first-year seminar, which is now in its third year. I know some of the students are here, and Ed's been a real cornerstone, as have others here. I want to begin my response to Ed's paper with his final point, which is the popular and scientific debate over the higher human consciousness and altruistic behavior, born in the earliest responses to Darwin's work, carry forward to the present. The Victorians' concern is our concern. They're our contemporaries. Darwin's ideas continue to inspire wonder, certainly, and at least for those of us who believe that humans are different because we have a soul, they also inspire some anxiety. When I teach Darwin and see the tree of life that he sketched in that 1830s notebook, some of you may have seen it when it was going around in the Darwin exhibit, I feel a sense of something like religious awe. I feel this when I look at the work of Rodney Honeycutt and his colleagues who are now tracing with precision the tree of life. And I feel a sense, a grateful sense of the unity that marks the created order. But then even Darwin sensed this kind of awe, and I think you feel it in the last paragraph of Origin of Species. Those of you who've read it will know it. The last paragraph reads, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst the planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful, most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." Notice his words, originally breathed. Well, what does he mean by this metaphor? Who originally breathed? Darwin probably had Genesis in mind. In Genesis 1, you know, God breathes or speaks the human being into existence. Let there be, all those times uttered. And the culmination of creation is the human being, made in God's image and likeness. In Genesis 2, in Genesis 2, God literally breathes Adamah, the originary mud creature. My friends who know Hebrew tell me Adam comes from Adamah, the mud creature, undifferentiated, yes? He breathes life into Adamah. But in the Darwinian scheme of evolution and the algorithmic workings of natural selection, when does God's breath enter into the human creature? How does it transpire? I know that Darwin, and here I'm quoting from Dissent, is, quote, concerned only with the truth as far as our reason permits us to discover it. And I know that when it comes to talk of the soul, science hits its limits. I accept evolutionary theory and the explanatory power that it's lent to the wondrous development of biology over the last 150 years. But my acceptance does complicate my concomitant belief that we're made imago Dei, image and likeness of God, and that we're called to recover the divine likeness and to dwell with God and our fellow human beings in eternal communal beatitude. As Ed observes, quote, from the very outset, what readers generally found most exciting or frightening about Darwinism was the prospect that humans evolved from beasts by a naturalistic process that goes back in some material cause and effect chain to the earliest forms of life. If, quote, human behavior is reduced to the physical and people become mere matter in motion, the image of God seems to disappear. It's no wonder that Darwin's teacher, Sedgwick, whose portrait we saw a while back, quote, never gave ground on a divine source for the human soul. For him and most other Victorians, as for many today, as Ed just said it, this isn't a laughing matter. I'll try to bring a little bit levity in a moment. We'll see if you laugh. Darwin anticipated our anxiety, okay? And in The Descent of Man, which I've also taught some parts of, after arguing that there is, quote, no fundamental difference between human mental powers and those of lower animals, he wrote, and this sentence really strikes me, few persons feel any anxiety from the possibility of determining at what precise period in the development of the individual man becomes an immortal being. Well, I do think there's a lot of anxiety about that issue. They're arguing about it in Congress right now with the health care plan and abortion. But then he turns it, he says, there's no greater cause for anxiety because the period cannot possibly be determined in the gradually ascending organic scale. It's this anxiety that I felt in the second grade. I was in St. Rita's school. I was in Mrs. Geisler's class. I remember it well. I was reading books about dinosaurs, loved Archaeopteryx, in love with all things prehistoric, really, learning about Adam and Eve and the fall and redemption, and I stood up to ask a question. It must have not been the first time that I had stood to ask such a question, because I stood up and I asked, but what about the cavemen? And Mrs. Geisler, good Mrs. Geisler's exasperated response was, please sit down, Mr. Contino. We've heard quite enough about the cavemen. I do remember it. I wasn't traumatized. I didn't need therapy for this. It was just that it was something I'd been belaboring. And I still teach Darwin, and it still haunts me. Many years later, I'm happy to discover that my anxiety was shared by the great Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, a practicing Catholic until his death in 2004, who observed that we are, to a large extent, children of the 19th century. As he relates in one of his last poems, entitled Treatise on Theology, his anxiety began even earlier than mine. Here's the poem. He begins when he's 6 years old, and it's basically discovering that he's an artist. Okay. 6 years old, I felt horror at the stony order of the world. Later on, in vain, I sought shelter in colorful pictures of birds when I was the round-faced secretary of the Circle of Nature Lovers. Charles Darwin, clergyman to be, announced with regret his theory of natural selection, for he saw it served the devil's theology. By proclaiming the triumph of the strong and the defeat of the weak, which is and has always been the devil's program, which is why he is called the prince of this world. Everything that creeps, runs, flies, and dies is an argument against the divinity of man, I turned to anti-nature, i.e. to art, in order to build our home along with others out of the sounds of music and paint on canvas and the rhythms of speech. Threatened at every moment, we marked our days on a calendar of stone or of paper, ready to be caught by a cold hand reaching out of the abyss to pull us down together with our unfinished task. Yet, we believed that some of us had received a gift, a grace, despite the force of gravity. I believe that literary artists are given a gift. They're graced. They grace us with their work. But the impress of gravity, chiefly in this case, an awareness that the human person is emergent from a natural world, red in tooth and claw, remains real. In his 1983 Norton Lectures at Harvard, Milosz reflected on the poet's burden in the wake of Darwin's discovery and its implications for the human image. And Michael Roos pointed to just this in his talk earlier. Here's Milosz. The adversaries of the theory of evolution, invoking its conflict with the Bible, apprised the danger correctly. For the imagination, once visited by the images of the evolutionary chain, is lost to certain varieties of religious belief. Copernicus' discovery deprived the Earth of its central place in the universe, but the discovery of man's animal origin was no less a shock, not only because the very singularity of being human was brought into question, but also because the attack was aimed indirectly at the meaning of human death, the question of immortality. Nature, in its incredible prodigality, producing billions of creatures necessary to maintain the species, is absolutely indifferent to the fate of the individual. Once integrated into nature, man also changes into a statistical cipher and becomes expendable. This erosion touches every human being's perception of life in terms of salvation and damnation. It's as if one's image of life, the traditional image, were covered by another one, the scientific, and thus produces the constant anxiety that arises when the mind cannot cope with contradiction and reproaches itself for inconsistency. Allow me to point to one other literary image. This is in the late 1800s. It's 1881. It's a book dear to Milosz, dear to many of you. It's one I love to cite. It's The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And in this scene, Dmitri, the oldest brother, is in prison, awaiting trial for the murder of his father. And he's visited by the saintly Alyosha, his younger brother. But he says he's just been speaking with a very different visitor, a guy named Mikhail Rakitin, who is a 19th century version of Daniel Dennett, who reduces human consciousness and conscience to the neurobiology of highly evolved nerve cells, and in so doing, denies the divine gift of human freedom. In the wake of this vision that Mikhail has left him, Dmitri tells Alyosha he's sorry for God. And I'll just read this passage. It's prescient. I mean, he really is looking forward to some contemporary biologists. What do you mean, Alyosha says, you're sorry for God? And Dmitri says, imagine, it's all there in the nerves, in the head. There are these nerves in the head, devil take them. There are all these little tails. These little nerves have little tails. Well, and when they start trembling, that is, you see, I look at something with my eyes like this, they start trembling, these little tails. And when they tremble, an image appears. Not at once, but in a moment. It takes a second. And then a certain moment appears, as it were, that is not a moment. Oh, devil take the moment. But an image, that is an object or an event. Well, devil take it. And that's why I contemplate and then think. Not at all because I'm a soul or am some sort of image and likeness. That's all foolishness. Mikhail's explained all that to me, brother, just yesterday. And it was as if I got burnt. It's magnificent, Alyosha, this science. The new man will come. I quite understand that, and yet I'm sorry for God. In the vision of Dostoevsky's last great novel, the new man is in fact Christ, whose image is reflected in the countenance of saintly others like Alyosha, and whom Dmitri never ceases to embrace. As Roger Lundeen has pointed out in his new book, Believing Again, many 19th century writers, like Emily Dickinson, for example, saw that the sanguine affirmation of nature's design by liberal Protestant natural theology would no longer suffice, and they made a Christological turn. They turned to Christ. This turn was, of course, articulated decades later and much more robustly by Karl Barth in his theology, which, as Lundin writes, came out of his recognition of the heartlessness of natural theology and drove him to develop a richly textured doctrine of Jesus Christ. I'm currently working on a book on the brothers and the image of Christ. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has just written a book on Dostoevsky, and he talks about this Christological turn in Dostoevsky's work, this turn to Christ. And in his conclusion to that book, he approvingly cites another novelist, Marilyn Robinson, who writes an essay on Darwinism in a book called The Death of Adam. And I recommend this longish essay. It's called Darwinism. In this essay, she bewails our culture's celebration of that death, the death, that is, of the only piece of creation made in the divine image, the one in whom God breathes. As Rowan Williams rightly observes, Robinson, and this is very important, is neither attacking theories of evolution nor defending creationism. Her target is the response of awe and fascination that is evoked in the contemporary intellectual milieu by theories designed to deny the distinctiveness of humanity. In her attack, Robinson bears affinities with her fellow Christian believer Dostoevsky, who, Rowan Williams writes, whose fiction is a sustained imaginative protest against the death of Adam. Dostoevsky knows very thoroughly the seduction, the paradoxical charm, even, of reductive and determinist anthropology. His use of biblical language, image and likeness, is an index of the importance of these categories to his imagination. I don't think any of us who are believing Christians, and I speak here in the midst of Rodney and Ed and others who believe in evolution and its process, but continue to be Christian believers. We can't do without that biblical language, image and likeness. It's vital for any Christian believer. The literary art of Robinson, Milosz, Dostoevsky bear testimony to this vitality. If our scientific understanding is to avoid reducing and even eradicating the human, though, it needs also to be educated by literary imaginations attuned to the reality of the human soul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both to Paul and to Ed. I think we have time for one or two questions before we have the movie for the afternoon. Any questions for either speaker?
As we're going to the questions, I'll put up one more image to show the continued relevance of Darwin and the people I was speaking about to this state of California. One of my favorite vistas over in eastern California is here, just you get part of it, but this is in the Sierra Nevadas in the early 1900s, and if you could get back, this only captures part of it, but you can go one place where they have the signs identifying all these peaks, and you will see right in a row, Mount Darwin is the tallest. This is in our state, California. You'll see Mount Darwin is the tallest, and Mount Haeckel's right near it. You'll see Mount Mendel and Mount Gray and Mount, literally Mount Spencer. They're all in a line right along the way. Let's see, who else is in there? Cope, I think, and Hayek. I think they both have one. Hooker's got one. And these are the mountains of California. So we see on the rooftop of our state, we see memorialized the people we're talking about. Question?
You give me men to match my mountains, I guess you said. The letter you read from Carnegie, the reference to Carnegie, made me wonder.
That's his autobiography.
Right. It made me wonder whether you found in reflections on Darwin any kind of expressions that, this evolution was a good thing because it relieved people of the idea of original sin. I mean, if we evolved from animals, then original sin as a doctrine sort of fell away. I don't know if that was in their thoughts consciously, if they thought about that.
The question was, in case people didn't get it, was there a conscious notion that Darwin freed people from original sin, and that was one of its attractions, and certainly it was. You saw that in the quote by Stanton, Elizabeth Stanton. And that was in her very popular book, Woman's Bible. And I took that quote. And she certainly felt that way. Many others did too as well. And Carnegie certainly felt that way. That was a conscious reflection of people. Now, how does it deal? You know, it gets into the question of the problem of evil and what impact that has. Sort of a related question, but I remember once talking. Ernst Mayr was mentioned this morning by Michael Roos, and I remember once talking to Ernst Mayr about this question. And he was a great American biologist. Proudly kept on his coffee table a listing that some magazine had published of the 100 greatest scientists of all time, in which he was 69, and so he kept that on his coffee table, so you could see that. And that wasn't just living; I think that was of all time. He said, I asked him about the science and religion question. He says, "Well, I once had that. I was wondering about that too." And he, of course, was one of the last survivors of the Jewish scientists who had left Germany to avoid possible imprisonment or death by the Nazis, and came to England and then the United States. And he said, and so he felt he had experienced this. He had experience here. He had some background. And he said, you know, I was wondering about that, and I wondered about, so I decided to go around to all my colleagues at Harvard who were members of the National Academy of Sciences, and there were lots of them, which is the elite scientific organization, elected science. And I asked them about their religious beliefs, sort of one-on-one. And every one of them was an agnostic or atheist. And I asked him why. And he said for virtually all of them, it was the problem of evil. You know, you could have thought it could be a lot of things, but it wasn't that they couldn't reconcile it with Darwinism per se, or they couldn't reconcile it with their science. They couldn't recognize it with the problem of evil. Now, he had lived through the Holocaust or just escaped it. But so that's dealing with how that issue comes up, and I think that there's a relation to your question there, and plays out in the scientist. More questions?
Are there any other questions? Yes, up front here, please.
I apologize, I'm not as well spoken as the speakers and as yourself as well, but there are a few issues that I took in your lecture. One that I just can't let pass. Do you believe that or is it your opinion that there is a causal link between Darwin's science and Hitler's Holocaust?
A causal link. You know, there might be a but-for link, which people in the law school would understand. But no, I don't think there's a direct causal relation. I don't think one led to the other. I think Hitler's Holocaust had multiple sources, but mostly in the sickness of Hitler's own mind, heavily rooted, unfortunately, in the Catholicism. Hitler was a Catholic, and he tied into this history of the Passion plays and the whole view that was. But you can see it in Luther too. So I'm not trying to. You got the Lutheran, but it was stronger, you know, at that time. And you can play up, you know, you can do those quantitative studies of how Hitler got elected the first time, and it was the religious vote that got him elected. So if you play the numbers out and try to figure out where his support was coming from disproportionately, of course it was coming from Bavaria, which was a more religious area. So no, I think there are lots of factors that played into it. But I certainly think that all ideas have consequences. And I think there's a factor that I can't deny, that there is some way. Now you can take any idea. You can take the Bible, or you can take Darwinism, or any idea that is worth its salt. Any idea that's worth having can be used in many different ways. Darwin himself was a very sentimental person. He gave freely to charity. He served in all sorts of roles. He was personally quite opposed to slavery. He was a Wedgwood, after all, and they were anti-slavery people. So you get a complex way you play it. But Ernst Haeckel, who adopts it, has a very different view. And his monist view, there's how you'd have to follow the length. But then if you unpack Haeckel, he was a Lamarckian. he was more Lamarckian, in my opinion, from my reading of Haeckel's work, than he was a Darwinian. He was an evolutionist, certainly, bringing a lot of Lamarckian ideas to the table. So, you know, it's a complex interaction, but I do think it was a part, and I do think it played it, and I think that it also played in World War I. I don't think that Darwinism caused World War I, but there was something that Brian was playing on, something in the books like Headquarters Nights, where an evolutionist like Vernon Kellogg from Stanford went over there and talked to these military leaders in Germany and told them that they were inspired, that this is a struggle for survival against our view, the Bismarckian view of the modern state, and the English view of the modern state. And ours is a more progressive view, and there's a sense of competition there. Haeckel especially believed in the competition between civilizations and between nation states more than Darwin pushed that idea. So yeah, I think there's a connection, but I think the sources of the Holocaust are rooted in a profound and complex evil, rather than direct. You can't tie it directly, but I think there's connections. Any other questions? Or is that it? All right.
Let's thank our speakers again.